Good day, everyone. Today's session will be looking at the introduction to natural resource economics. In this session, we'll basically be looking at the classification of natural resources, looking at a working definition for natural resource economics, a few fundamental concepts to do with economics and natural resource economics, and the impact of natural resource economics. So that's basically what we're going to cover during this session. Well, once we're looking at the classification of natural resources, let's try maybe to define what natural resources are. Natural resources, taken as all the original resources of the earth that are utilized by people, and the range of natural services provided by these resources that support life and economic activity. Thus, natural resources include industrial raw materials and renewable resources, such as when you look at timber or fisheries, but also other environmental common property resources, such as clean, fresh water that is used in or support any economic activity. So some of these resources, such as minerals or oil, do exist as finite stocks, which are non-renewable within an economic time frame, while others, such as timber or solar energy, are renewable, and potentially the flow of such services from these resources can be harvested indefinitely. Many of these renewable resources, such as fish, timber, and even water, can be mismanaged and degraded and can eventually get exhausted. A more useful distinction may therefore be made between stock and flow of resources. What we need to note is that these natural resources are derived from the environment, and some of the resources are essential to survival, while others merely satisfy social wants. And every man-made product in an economy is composed of natural resources to some degree. So you look at within most of the production processes, you would have natural resources being used, and then you also have some sort of output, be it the intended product or a byproduct of that production process. There are numerous ways to classify the types of natural resources. You can classify natural resources using the source of origin, the state of development, and the renewability of the resources. Firstly, let's look at source of origin. How would we divide natural resources based on source of origin? One, we've got biotic resources. These resources come from living and organic material such as forests and animals, and include the materials that can be obtained from them. Looking at biotic natural resources, you also have fossil fuels such as coal and petroleum, which are formed from organic matter that has decayed. So these are more or less taken as biotic resources. Abiotic resources come from non-living and non-organic material. Examples of these resources include land, fresh water, air, heavy metals. It's looking at gold, iron, copper, and silver. The second classification is based on the stage of development of these natural resources. So we can look at more or less 4 stages. So one, we can classify natural resources as potential resources. These are the resources that exist in a region and may be used in future. For example, if a country has petroleum in sedimentary rocks, it is a potential resource until it is actually drilled out of the rock and put into use. 2, we have got actual resources. These are the resources that have been surveyed. Their quantity and quality has been determined and they are currently being used. And the development of actual resources is dependent on technology. As you know, to really survey, know the quantity and the quality of resources. Take an example of some of the minerals, you really need the right technology to do that. So once you have got the right technology to survey these resources, that's when you'll be in a position to know the actual resources that you have. And you've got reserve resources. This is part of an actual resource that can be developed profitably in the future. You might have that's the resource which you have surveyed, you know the quantity, but you cannot really profitably exploit just because maybe you don't have the right technology to exploit such kind of a resource, or the prices are low and it doesn't make any economic sense to exploit such kind of resources. You would classify those as reserve resources just because they are there. They are an actual resource, but can only be developed profitably in the future. And we have stock resources. These are resources that have been surveyed but cannot be used due to lack of technology. An example of such a resource is hydrogen. Let's continue looking at these stock resources. We would say these are mostly compounds which have taken millions of years to form, and so from an economic perspective may be considered as fixed in supply. There is therefore a limit to the quantity of these which can ultimately be used. But however, in many cases, we do not know where this limit lies. And in most cases, these can cause difficulties in designing policies to ensure optimal allocation. And in most cases, with existing technologies, many metals can be reused with little loss of quality, and in principle, their total stock could remain constant over time, taking account both of the metal remaining in the earth crust and that which is temporarily stored in the products. Thus, we may make a further classification into theoretically having recoverable stocks and recyclable stocks. The other aspect on how we classify resources, we look at flow resources. Flow resources are defined as those resources which can be naturally renewed within a sufficient ratio time span to be of relevance to decision makers. But it is useful to make a further distinction between those flows which do not appear to be dependent on human activity and those which are indefinitely renewable if use remains at or below their capacity to reproduce or regenerate. The latter, that's the so-called critical zone resources, can however be exploited to exhaustion. If the rate of use exceeds the rate of natural replenishment, such resources can effectively be mined like a mineral stock. Non-critical zone resources remain renewable irrespective of human activity. Now let's look at reserves in a little bit more detail. There's need to make a distinction between the currently exploitable resources and the theoretically exploitable resources. Usually, current resource appraisers often identify currently exploitable resources as reserves. And these are the supplies of materials or energy which are exploitable in political, economic, and technical terms under current conditions. Other sources may not be currently exploitable, but may become so if extraction technology improves or if demand for the resource is high enough to justify exploitation of these more difficult or costly resources. In other words, they may become part of the reserves in future. So you may have exploitable resources or theoretically exploitable resources. They become just theoretically exploitable resources just because they are more or less not economically meaningful to be exploited during that point in time, just because you might not have the right technology to extract such kind of resources. The most common classification of natural resources has to do with their renewability. So we talk about renewable natural resources, which are resources that can be replenished. Examples of such renewable resources include sunlight, air, and wind. These are available continuously and their quantity is not noticeably affected by any human consumption. And secondly, we've got non-renewable natural resources, and these resources form extremely slow and do not naturally form in the environment. A resource is considered to be non-renewable when their rate of consumption exceeds the rate of recovery. A good example of non-renewable resources would be minerals or fossil fuels. Now let's look at a few concepts or terms which will come across this course. The first is sustainable development. This is a concept or term which I take you have come across in other courses which you have done within the program. So, as you're already aware, the basic premise of sustainable development is that activities to promote it need to take into account the needs of both current and future generations. Importantly, the activities of the current generation should not compromise the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Thus, the concept of intergenerational equity is central to most definitions of sustainable development. So what is key is to understand the concept of intergenerational equity. You look at most of the definitions of sustainable development, look into how we take care of intergenerational equity on how we use resources. Additionally, for an activity or policy to be sustainable, it needs to be economically, environmentally, and socially sustainable. Though it can be difficult to define with any precision the criteria for sustainability in each of these three dimensions, let alone specify the trade-offs and synergies that exist between economic, social, and environmental goals. Identifying the needs of current generations is fraught with difficulty. Doing the same for future generations also faces even bigger obstacles. Sustainable development can therefore be defined in many different ways, and defining it for practical purposes is ultimately the outcome of political processes. So you would see in many textbooks or in different countries, they would usually define sustainable development in their own way, but the focus is to ensure that there is that intergenerational equity in the use of resources. The other concept we need to know and take into consideration is to do with income and growth. At the macro level, natural resource economics typically approaches the sustainable development debate with a somewhat narrower focus, namely that of income and economic growth. It usually assumes that economic growth is desired goal because by enhancing people's income and consumption, it raises their welfare. It then looks at how different patterns of natural resource use affect that goal, not only in terms of present income, but also in terms of the income of future generations. You need to bear in mind, though, that whilst natural resource economics is implicitly concerned with macroeconomic growth, its practical application typically takes place at the micro level. For example, identifying efficient and sustainable harvesting rates for renewable resources, or analyzing the economic effects of different rates of non-renewable resource extraction. So you see, once you're looking at natural resource economics, its practical application is based at the macro level. The other concept which we really need to understand is the steady state equilibrium. In the context of renewable natural resources in particular, one definition of sustainability relates to the concept of a steady state equilibrium. In this case, a steady state refers to a stock size and a flow of services that is sustained over an indefinite period of time. In other words, a steady state is a kind of equilibrium which, in the absence of any outside forces, can be sustained forever. However, it has been argued that a steady state is rather an extreme and unrealistic target at which to aim in relation to the real world natural resource management. Indeed, in very few cases has the history of natural resource use remotely resembled anything even approaching the hypothetical steady state. Therefore, some have suggested that perhaps a more realistic sustainability target might be to prevent renewable resources flows from declining. So the best way is to ensure that actually you prevent renewable resource flows from declining. Sustainability target runs into a host of problems when applied in the real world. So in practice, a host of complex trade-offs and conflicting objectives will usually need to be assessed on a case-by-case basis in relation to real-world natural resource management. So on how you deal with a host of problems in the real world, once you're looking at sustainability, that has to be tackled on a case-by-case basis. The other terms we need to understand are substitutability and irreversibility. An important factor in assessing the sustainability of natural resource flows relates to the issues of substitutability and irreversibility. One, when you're talking about substitutability, we're referring to the extent to which the function performed by the flow of one natural resource could be performed by an alternative resource. That might be natural or man-made. And irreversibility draws attention to the risks of exploiting resources in ways that lead to irreversible changes in the stocks or flows of variable natural resources. Now, you need just to reflect and think of any examples where one natural resource might be substituted by another natural resource or by a man-made resource. Try before you move on just to think of any examples where one natural resource might be substituted by another natural resource or by a man-made resource. Also try to think of a few more examples where irreversibility might be of particular concern. Take these as activities which you might need to work on in the next few hours to see if you really understand the two concepts. Now let's look at one major branch of economics which has greatly influenced natural resource economics, and this is welfare economics. Welfare economics seeks to understand how different allocations of resources affect the welfare of society as a whole, or indeed specific interest groups within a society. It combines neoclassical theories of the consumer and the firm with utilitarian theories of ethics produce decision-making criteria that can be used by policymakers to rank alternative ways of allocating scarce resources. And drawing on utilitarianism, these rankings are usually set according to the level of benefit each allocation of resources conveys to society as a whole, and estimates of social benefit or social value are based upon the underlying assumption that individuals are the best judge of what is in their interests, and that if competitive markets existed for all scarce resources, these interests or preferences would be implicitly revealed in aggregate by the way markets respond to each individual's participation in such marketplace. Under these assumptions, the equilibrium prices resulting from the interaction of supply and demand in competitive markets for both inputs and outputs are said to reflect the value that society places on goods and services and factors of production. So looking at land, labor, and capital. These prices form the basis of the calculated values that welfare economics uses to compare one resource allocation against the other. Of course, we've been talking about competitive markets, but these often do not exist. Hence, much effort in welfare economics is devoted to finding ways to, one, make these markets more competitive, to correct the price signals that emanate from non-competitive markets so that the resulting resource allocations move closer to the competitive ideal. 3, to create competitive markets for scarce resources that are not currently allocated through market mechanisms. And 4, identify what preferences would be revealed if there were competitive markets, for example, through experiment and surveys, so that where market allocation is not possible, resources can be allocated as though it were. But we need to bear in mind that the preferences revealed in competitive markets, and hence the resulting market prices, are governed in part by each individual's purchasing power. Since this is the function of their wealth, it is possible that significant alterations in the distribution of wealth within society would reveal a different set of preferences and lead to an alternative set of market prices for use as the metric in social evaluations. However, welfare comparisons between alternative resource allocations also need to be based upon the same metric. That is, they need to be based upon the same set of prices. Hence, when welfare economics compares different resource allocations, it basically assumes that the underlying distribution of wealth associated with each option is broadly the same. With these, I think we can now move on to try and define what natural resource economics is all about. I would say natural resource economics mostly focuses on the supply, demand, and allocation of the Earth's natural resources. Natural resource economics focuses on the supply, demand, and allocation of the Earth's natural resources. Its goal is to gain a better understanding of the role of natural resources in the economy. We rely on natural resources different, so one has to understand what role the natural resources a country has play within the economy. You look at fisheries in Namibia. What role really does fisheries play in the economy of Namibia? We look at the minerals, that's the mining sector. What role does mining play in the Namibian economy? So learning about the role of natural resources allows for the development of more sustainable methods to manage these resources and make sure that they are maintained for future generations. Therefore, the goal of natural resource economics is to develop an efficient economy that is sustainable in the long run. So let's get a little bit history of the background of natural resource economics. In most cases, natural resource economics is studied as one discipline with environmental economics. And you'd see the main text for this course also combines these two. It's a natural resource and environmental economics text. So natural resource economics and indeed environmental economics draw heavily on the neoclassical approach to economics, including the models and techniques of neoclassical welfare analysis. And the distinctions between natural resource economics and environmental economics are increasingly broad, as I've said earlier on, that these two are often studied together as a single discipline. So they are mostly interrelated. But in this course, we'll try just to focus on those issues which basically relate to natural resource economics. So the study of natural resource economics has tended to focus on raw materials, treating them as inputs in a production function, and exploring related input and output markets and the efficiency and welfare implications of different patterns of resource exploitation. The approach is often exemplified by the following or related models. That's the fisheries model. You look at the forestry timber extraction model or the non-renewable resource model. Now let us quickly look at what environmental economics and ecological economics are. Firstly, we look at environmental economics. We need to note that environmental economics was driven by many of the same concerns as natural resource economics. It's looking at sustainable harvesting of natural resources, but also included a special focus on the problem of pollution and the value of the environment as a place to live in and value for its own sake. Much of the modern environmental economics is focused on ways of addressing environmental externalities, such as pollution. It is therefore important to bear in mind that environmental economics and natural resource economics are complementary rather than competing fields of study. Both fields offer useful sets of tools for studying particular types of environmental problems. That's why I said they are more or less complementary than competing fields. While ecological economics has a rather different roots from those of either natural resource or environmental economics. That's what we are saying. Ecological economics is different from natural resource or environmental economics. Whilst the latter bring the environment into economics, that's applying conventional economic tools and analysis to environmental and natural resource problems, ecological economics brings the economy into the environment. That's it expands the study of ecological systems to include the economic systems that operate within and across ecological system and subsystem boundaries. Whilst environmental and natural resource economists use similar sets of tools to examine a slightly different set of problems, ecological economics challenges. Challenges excessive reliance on this set of tools. Its tools seek to integrate insights from a much broader range of disciplines in both the natural and social sciences. So once you're looking at ecological economics, you use tools which integrate insights from much broader range of disciplines. That's looking at the natural and the social sciences. Now let's look at a few basic fundamental terms before we wrap up the session for today. As we have earlier looked on, natural resource economics addresses problems of governing common pool natural resources or finding dynamically optimal rates of resource extraction and the workings of resource and energy markets. But now we are studying a branch of economics. For those maybe who did not do economics at the undergrad level, what is economics? We have been talking about natural resource economics, environmental economics, ecological economics, welfare economics. What is economics. In simple terms, economics is the study of how scarce resources are allocated among competing uses. The choice problem of how to allocate is implied by the condition of scarcity. And so, economy or minimization of waste occurs when resources are allocated to their highest valued use. So we are saying economics is the study of how scarce resources are allocated among competing uses. What do we mean when we say scarcity? Something is said to be scarce when at zero price, more is wanted than is available. A product or a resource or anything is said to be scarce when at zero price, more is wanted than is available. The economic problem of allocating scarce resources in the context of competing uses is not unique to humans. Other forms of life also respond to conditions of scarcity, and one can also argue that natural selection tends to favor those organisms which are most successful in allocating their time and energy in the context of scarcity. Another term or another concept which we need to remind ourselves of is opportunity cost. Something scarce can be allocated to a variety of different uses. But when something is scarce is allocated to one particular use, the opportunity cost of that choice is the value of the best alternative given, which has been given up. When something is scarce is allocated to one particular use, the opportunity cost of that choice is the value of the best alternative which has been given up. And now, what is economic rationality? This is one of the terms will come along in this course. What do we mean when we say economic rationality? This is a choice from among competing options where it's said to be economical rational when it yields anticipated net benefits that exceed the opportunity cost. A choice from among competing options is said to be economically rational when it yields anticipated net benefits that exceed the opportunity cost. I hope that is clear enough. But now, what's the impact of natural resource economics? Why really do we need to study natural resource economics? What impact does it have? We would see in most cases that the findings of natural resource economists are used by governments and organizations to better understand how to efficiently use and sustain natural resources. And the findings by these natural resource economists are used to gain insights into one of the following environmental areas. One, in extraction. That's we're looking at the process of withdrawing resources from nature. That's what we call extraction. In this case, extractive industries are a basis for the primary sector of the economy. The extraction of natural resources substantially increases a country's worth. There's no doubt about that. And economists study extraction rates to make sure that resources are not depleted. Decisions have to be made to ensure that actually the revenue or the income which comes out of these extractive industries is maintained for a longer term to ensure once these resources are being extracted at the right rate, you are also assured of steady flow of income into the economy. And if resources are extracted too quickly, the sudden inflow of money can cause inflation in an economy. So economists would seek to maintain a sense of balance within the extraction industries. Another area is to do with depletion. That's the using up of natural resources, which is considered to be a global sustainable development issue. Many governments and organizations have become increasingly involved in preserving natural resources. Therefore, economists would provide data to determine how to balance the needs of societies now and preserve resources for the future. The issue is you need one to analyze the available data and see how best the resources which we have now can be preserved for future generations while we are also extracting and generating revenue for the present generation. The other aspect has to do with protection. On protection, we're looking at the preservation of natural resources for the future. The findings of economists would help governments and organizations develop measures of protection to sustain natural resources. Protection policies state the necessary actions internationally, nationally, and individually that must take place to control natural resource depletion that is a result of human activity. And the other aspect one looks at is management. That's the use of natural resources, taking into account economic, environmental, and social concerns. This process deals with managing natural resources such as land, water, soil, plants, and animals. And particular focus is placed on how the preservation of natural resources impacts the quality of life now and for future generations. So how best do we manage our natural resources, taking into account the economic, environmental, and social concerns, whereby we make sure that it supports the natural resources, supports the quality of life now, and also for future generations. The other concepts we really need to understand have to do with externalities and their impacts on resource allocation. Externalities and their impacts on resource allocation. What do we mean once we're talking about resource allocation? Resource allocation is division of goods for the use of production within an economy. The needs and the wants of a society as well as industries impact on what is produced. Usually suppliers focus on producing varieties of goods and services that will yield the greatest satisfaction to consumers. And in the long run, externalities directly impact resource allocation. And it is therefore necessary to determine whether production, as well as the process of production, creates more benefits than costs for producers, consumers, and the society as a whole. Any need to determine whether any process of production creates more benefits than costs for producers, consumers, and the society as a whole. And when we are talking about externalities, what do we mean? An externality is a cost or benefit that affects a party who did not choose to incur the cost or benefit. An externality is a cost or a benefit that affects a party who did not choose to incur the cost or the benefit. In regards to natural resources, production and use of resources can have positive or negative effects on the allocation of resources. So, what are these external costs? A negative externality, also called an external cost, imposes a negative effect on a third party to an economic transaction. Many negative externalities impact natural resources negatively because of the environmental consequences of production and use. Let's take, for example, air pollution from factories and vehicles can cause damage to crops. Likewise, water pollution has a negative impact on plants and animals. These are external costs. In the case of negative externalities, the marginal private cost of consuming a good is less than the marginal social or public cost. Thus, the marginal social benefit needs to equal the marginal social cost. That is, production should only be increased when the marginal social benefit exceeds the marginal social cost. Thus, production needs to be increased only when the marginal social benefit exceeds the marginal social cost. When external costs are present, the use of natural resources is mostly inefficient because the social benefit is less than the social cost. In other words, society and the natural resources involved would have been better off if the natural resources had not been used at all. Once the marginal social cost is greater than the social benefit or is greater than the marginal social benefit, it means that it would have been better off if those natural resources had not been used at all. And developed countries use more natural resources. In that regard, they enact sustainable development plan for the use of resources. In that regard, human needs must be met, but the environment and natural resources must be preserved. Examples of resource depletion in, in the mining sector, once you're looking at petroleum extraction, fishing, forestry, and in the agricultural sector. So let's look at what is happening within Namibia. Let's look at fishing industry or the forestry industry. Are our resources being depleted or not? Lastly, let's look what external costs. Now, let's look at what external benefits are. These are also referred to as positive externalities. These impose a positive effect on a third party. We've said the external cause impose a negative effect on a third party, but the positive externalities impose a positive effect on a third party. An example of a positive externality is when, let's say, crops are pollinated by bees from a neighboring bee farm. You've got a bee farm in a different plot, and you have got crops in a different farm altogether. So when crops are pollinated by bees from a neighboring farm, would take this as a positive externality. And in order to achieve the socially optimal equilibrium, the marginal social benefit should equal the marginal social cost. In this case, production should be increased as long as the marginal social benefit exceeds the marginal social cost. And assuming that natural resources are used and also sustained, the external benefits of goods produced by natural resources would impact the majority of the public in a positive way. This marks the end of the introductory session to natural resource economics. We have looked at how we can classify natural resources. We have defined natural resource economics. We looked at other branches of economics which are more less related or have got a bearing on natural resource economics. That we're looking at environmental economics, ecological economics. We'll also looked at one branch of neoclassical economics, that's welfare economics, and a few more other fundamental concepts which will come along in this course. And we have also looked at the impact of natural resource economics. That's more or less giving reasons why it is necessary to have natural resource economies within a country. How does their work really impact a country per se? So that's it for the session. We meet again in a few days. Thank you so much.